Judge laughs at poor teen in courtroom until the boy reveals who his father really is. The courtroom wasn't crowded. Just another Tuesday, just another minor case in juvenile court downtown. But what happened in the next 5 minutes would stay in people's minds long after the papers were filed away. A Latino teenager, barely 17, stood alone in front of the bench. His posture was tense, not defiant, just held together like something that might fall apart if you looked too close. He wore a faded hoodie with the sleeves pushed up, revealing thin forearms with small calluses. His name, Mateo Rivera. The bailiff announced the judge's arrival, and all stood. Then came the voice. Sharp, cold. It belonged to a police officer seated to the right of the gallery, arms crossed, already smirking. Guess he dressed up for the occasion, he muttered, just loud enough. A few in the room turned. The officer didn't flinch. His name tag read, Officer T. Granger. And he didn't care who heard. Mateo didn't look at him, didn't react. He stared ahead. But something flickered across his face, something like restraint, like someone biting down so hard on their dignity it might draw blood. That was when the judge called his name. Mateo Rivera. You're charged with resisting arrest, vandalism, and obstructing a peace officer. The words landed heavily, even though they had been rehearsed. Mateo opened his mouth, but didn't speak. Not yet. This is Cracks of Light. And sometimes, stories that start in shadows lead to the brightest truths. If you believe in second chances, in dignity, in justice that shows up when it matters most, make sure you subscribe. We tell real stories, cinematic and human, stories you'll feel in your bones. And now, back to Mateo. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense bob and polished heels, leaned forward and started her statement. The defendant was apprehended outside a convenience store at 9:42 p.m. after a report of possible loitering and suspicious behavior. Upon questioning, he became verbally aggressive and attempted to flee. That's a lie, Mateo said softly. Not a yell, not a challenge, just a simple sentence, said with a kind of exhausted calm. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Rivera, you'll have your chance to speak. But the officer, Granger, cut in again. Your Honor, I was there. He mouthed off. Typical street punk attitude. Just another one of these kids who think they don't have to listen to authority. There was a silence. The judge turned. Officer Granger, we're in court. I will not tolerate unprofessional conduct, but it was too late. Everyone had heard it. Everyone had heard the word these. The gallery shifted uneasily. Mateo's public defender, a young woman named Cassandra with tired eyes and a briefcase that had seen too many battles, glanced sideways. She put a hand on Mateo's arm and whispered, Stay calm. Don't speak unless I say. And he nodded, not because he was trained to obey, but because he was used to surviving. Mateo's file was thin, but not because there was nothing to say. He had no prior convictions, no school suspensions, no juvenile records. What he had were responsibilities. Mateo Rivera had been working part-time since the age of 13, dishwashing, landscaping, running grocery bags for neighbors. His mother, Lucia, had passed 3 years ago from sudden stroke. Since then, it had just been him and his younger sister, Camila. She was 10, bright, talkative, always asking questions he never had time to answer. They lived in a small one-bedroom apartment in Pilsen. Rent was always just barely paid. Mateo took care of the groceries, made sure Camila got to school, and still showed up to night classes at a local GED program. He wanted to finish school. He wanted to become something Camila could point to and say, my brother did that. He never thought of himself as brave. He thought of himself as tired, but kind. That night, the night of the arrest, he had stopped by the convenience store to pick up milk and bread. Camila liked cinnamon toast in the morning. He never left her without breakfast. He had barely gotten out of the store when he heard the shout, Hey, you! 2 officers, one with a hand on his holster. The other, Granger, had that same smug tilt in his step. What are you doing here? One of them asked. Buying groceries, Mateo answered, holding up the bag. They didn't like that. They asked for ID. He gave it. They ran it, found nothing. Still didn't let him go. When he asked if he could leave, one of them said, Only when we say so. And when he took a step away, they shoved him. Hard, he didn't fight back. But they said he resisted. Said he reached for something. Said he looked like someone they were watching. They cuffed him right there. Camila's bread spilled on the street. And now, 2 weeks later, here he was. In court. Alone. Called a criminal before he even got a chance to explain from the back row. A janitor swept the hallway while the courtroom doors creaked closed. He paused, looked in. Just a second. Then moved on. The courtroom felt colder now. Like the air had tightened. Officer Granger leaned back in his chair and smirked again. Maybe he didn't resist. Maybe he just got scared. I mean, they scare easy, don't they? He whispered, not realizing the mic had picked it up. The courtroom froze. The judge glared at him. The prosecutor's eyes widened. Mateo didn't move, but his attorney stood. Your Honor, I'd like to request that Officer Granger's comments be struck from the record, and I'd like the court to consider if his continued presence is appropriate. The judge nodded slowly. Request noted. Officer Granger, take a seat outside until further notice. Granger rolled his eyes, but the judge's stare was iron. He left, muttering. That was the first small shift. A breath, a pause in the tide. But still Mateo stood there. Alone. Mateo, the judge said finally, softer this time. Do you have anything you wish to say? He looked at Cassandra. She nodded gently. So he stepped forward. Just one step. My name is Mateo Rivera, he began. I'm 17. I take care of my little sister, Camila. I go to school at night. I didn't do what they said. I didn't resist. I just wanted to get home. He looked down. No one's ever believed me when I said stuff like that before. So maybe you won't either. He didn't cry. He didn't plead. He just told the truth like someone telling you where it hurts. The judge stared at him. Not unsympathetically. But judges aren't there to feel. They're there to decide. Then the doors creaked again. Footsteps. Sharp. Measured. Confident that a man walked in, straight-backed. Eyes scanning the room like radar. He wore a tan military uniform, ribbon sharp on his chest, boots polished to reflection. The air shifted. Mateo didn't turn. But Cassandra stiffened. The judge's eyes widened slightly. The prosecutor stopped mid-note, because the man who just entered the room was Major General Rafael Rivera, but he didn't speak. Not yet. He just looked at Mateo and said quietly, That's my son. If you're ready to follow the story of dignity, injustice, and the kind of strength that doesn't shout but stand its ground, stay with us. Mateo's journey has just begun, and what happens next will make this courtroom remember his name. That if you felt the quiet ache of being misunderstood, if you believe respect must be earned, not demanded, then this story is for you. Subscribe to Cracks of Light for more stories that heal, that challenge, and that shine in the darkest corners. And if this moved you, let us know, because your voice matters here. The silence that followed the words, "That's my son," didn't feel like silence at all. It felt like every breath in the room had been sucked into a vacuum, like time itself had stalled at the threshold of something unexpected. Mateo still hadn't turned around. He didn't need to. He knew the voice. And yet, it sounded different now. Not like the calls that had come once a month. Not like the words that had passed through crackling lines from a base somewhere halfway around the world. This voice was here, present, weighted with something else. Responsibility, maybe even regret. The judge was the first to recover. She looked at the man in uniform, then at the boy standing at the front of the court, then back again. General Rivera, she said quietly, this is a closed juvenile hearing. Her tone wasn't hostile, just cautious. Respectful. He gave a nod. I understand, Your Honor, but I believe there's context here that hasn't been considered. And since I've just returned from deployment less than 48 hours ago, I asked permission to speak, not just as his father, but as someone whose name appears on his guardianship papers. That last part surprised even Cassandra. She turned to Mateo, a flicker of confusion on her face. Mateo finally turned then, not fully, but enough to glance at the man he hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. General Rivera's eyes softened, but only slightly. He was still a soldier, still a man made of discipline and years of command. But there was something else too, something behind the sharp crease of his collar and the medals pinned like stories on his chest. The judge adjusted her glasses. Very well. Proceed. Rafael Rivera stepped forward. He didn't take the witness stand. He didn't ask for ceremony. He just stood beside his son. For a second, it looked awkward, like a commander standing next to a civilian. But when he spoke, the edge in his voice was gone. Mateo has made mistakes, he began. So have I. But let's not mistake silence for guilt, or strength for aggression. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't vandalize property. He was stopped without cause and pushed without provocation. And the officer who did it has a history, when I began researching the moment I landed. He handed a file to Cassandra, who opened it and froze. Inside were printed screenshots, internal reports, and 3 previous complaints of racial profiling against Officer Granger. Unresolved, ignored, forgotten. The judge took the file with a frown, flipping through its contents slowly. "Why are we just seeing this now?" she asked. Raphael's voice didn't rise. "Because I didn't know until this morning. Because my son didn't tell me. Because we've been estranged since his mother died." That word, estranged, it hung in the air like a bitter scent. Mateo looked down again. He didn't want pity. He wanted the moment to end. But his father wasn't done. Mateo kept Camila in school. He held down work. He walked away from fights even when his pride begged him not to. He's not perfect, but if you want to accuse him, make sure you're accusing the right things. Because what happened 2 weeks ago wasn't resistance. It was fear. And frankly, I'm tired of fear being labeled as defiance when it's coming from boys who look like my son. The room was still quiet. No one looked at Mateo directly, but something had shifted. Again, the judge tapped her pen slowly against the desk. She looked at Cassandra. "Do you have anything to add?" Cassandra stood. Her voice was calm. "We request all charges be dropped pending review of Officer Granger's conduct and a formal internal investigation into his behavior on the night of the arrest." The prosecutor didn't argue. She just nodded once. She had heard the recording, the smirk, the comment. She knew this case would stain more than a reputation if it went further. The judge leaned back. "I will take this under consideration and render a decision by tomorrow morning. In the meantime, Mateo is released under parental custody." It should have felt like a victory, like something cracked open in favor of truth. But when Mateo walked out of that courtroom with his father beside him, he didn't feel relief. He felt exposed, as if the world had just seen a part of him he'd spent years trying to cover up with silence. Outside, the sky was a heavy gray. Rain hadn't started yet, but it would. Raphael offered his coat. Mateo didn't take it. They stood there for a minute, side by side, not speaking, just letting the moment breathe. Then finally, Raphael said, "I didn't know they'd treat you like that." Mateo shrugged. "It happens." That answer, so simple, made Raphael flinch. Not visibly, but inwardly, deeply. He had spent 20 years in the military, leading battalions, handling foreign crises, surviving deployments. And yet nothing in those years had prepared him for a sentence like that from his own son. They walked to the parking lot. An old car waited. Not Raphael's. Cassandra's. She had offered to drive Mateo home, assuming he wouldn't want to go with the man he hadn't called Dad in years. But when she saw the two of them walk together, she paused. Mateo looked at her, then looked back at Raphael, then nodded. "You can take me." The drive was quiet. Raphael didn't turn on the radio. Mateo didn't look at him. But every red light stretched longer than usual. And somewhere along 18th Street, as they passed the elementary school Camila went to, Raphael said, "I'm sorry I left it all to you." Mateo didn't answer, but he didn't walk out of the car either. That was enough. When they pulled up to the apartment building, Mateo opened the door. "She'll be back from school in an hour," he said. Raphael nodded. "I'll wait." He followed his son up the cracked steps and through a hallway that smelled faintly of detergent and burnt toast. Inside the apartment, it was small, tidy, sparse. A stack of school papers sat on the kitchen table. A drawing of a butterfly taped to the fridge. Raphael looked around and saw traces of a boy who had become a man too soon. Mateo opened the fridge, poured 2 glasses of water, and set one down. No invitation, just presence. Raphael sat. Slowly, he looked at the picture on the wall. Lucia, his wife, her smile unchanged, her absence louder than any lecture he might have prepared. "She'd be proud of you," he said. Mateo took a sip of water. "She wanted us to stay together." "I know." Raphael whispered at a knock at the door. Light, rhythmic. Camila. She bounded in with her backpack and a face full of joy until she saw the uniform. She paused. Poppy, she asked. It had been a long time since she used the word. He knelt, opened his arms. She ran to him. Mateo looked away. The apartment filled with voices then, with Camila's chatter and the clink of a spoon in a cup, with questions about dinner and math homework and whether Raphael would stay the night. But underneath it all, there was a quiet thrum, a beat of uncertainty, of something fragile trying to form. Later that night, after Camila had gone to bed, Raphael stood by the window. The city hummed outside. Mateo leaned against the doorway. You didn't have to come to court. Raphael turned. Yes, I did. Mateo stared at him, then said the thing he'd never said before. You didn't come when she died. Raphael's jaw clenched. I couldn't. I was halfway across the world. You could have tried, Mateo said. I needed you. Raphael stepped forward. Not with anger, not with apology, just truth. I failed you, but I'm here now, and I will be, if you let me. Mateo looked at him for a long time, then nodded. Just once. In another part of the city, Officer Granger stood in front of his superior's desk, a printout of the court transcript in hand, his face pale. The audio clip had gone viral in a small circle already. The internal affairs officer didn't speak. He didn't need to. Granger's fate was already unraveling. Back in Pilsen, Raphael pulled a blanket over Camila's small sleeping form. Mateo watched from the hallway. For the first time in years, the apartment didn't feel like something he had to carry alone, but outside, parked just down the street, a black SUV sat in silence. Inside it, a woman in civilian clothes rewound the court footage again. Her badge sat on the dashboard. DHS. She had questions about what really happened that night, about Officer Granger's contacts, about why a 17-year-old with no record became target. She hit play again, watched the moment the general walked in, and smiled. The story wasn't over. Not yet, because Mateo Rivera didn't know it yet, but the night of his arrest was connected to something deeper, something he was about to uncover. But for now, he slept, for the first time in weeks. Not peacefully, but not alone. The morning after court, the sky was low and heavy with unspoken rain. Mateo stood at the window, watching the streets wake up. Delivery trucks rumbled by. An old man walked his dog. Life moved as if nothing had changed. But inside, something had. Not in some dramatic, movie-like way. Just a subtle shift, like the weight on his chest had moved an inch to the side. He still didn't know how to look at his father. He still didn't know what would happen next. But at least now, someone else had heard him. At least now, he wasn't invisible. Camila stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about multiplication tables. Mateo smiled. She had no idea what he had almost lost, or what had almost been written into his life forever by a single officer's word. By noon, Raphael was already dressed, boots laced, collar sharp. Old habits didn't fade. He had made coffee and breakfast, two things he hadn't done in this apartment for years. Mateo noticed the way he moved, quiet but deliberate, like someone still used to living in rooms where the smallest sounds meant something. You don't have to do that, Mateo said, watching him clean the dishes. Raphael didn't look up. I know, but I want to. Later that afternoon, Cassandra called. Her voice was careful, lined with something that didn't sound like relief. We just had a tip. Someone from Internal Affairs is reopening Officer Granger's file. Not just because of your case, Mateo. There's more. Old complaints that were buried. Some linked to a precinct cleanup operation. And someone else is asking questions. Not from the city. Mateo's chest tightened. What do you mean? Cassandra lowered her voice. Department of Homeland Security. A woman from D.C. She's watching the case. She asked for copies of your transcript and surveillance footage from that night. Why? I don't know, but I think it's bigger than we thought. That night, the rain finally came. Not a storm, just a quiet, steady drizzle that made the city blur outside the windows. Mateo sat at the table, flipping through Camila's homework. Raphael was on the couch, typing on a laptop. They didn't talk much, not about what mattered. But the silence wasn't cold anymore, just cautious. as if neither of them wanted to start something they didn't know how to finish. Then came a knock. Not loud, not angry, just two slow raps. Raphael opened the door. A man in a charcoal gray suit stood outside, holding a badge. Agent Michelle Landers, DHS, the woman beside him said. Her voice was steady, polite but firm. We'd like to ask Mateo a few questions. Privately. Raphael hesitated. What about? Michelle glanced at Mateo, then back. About what really happened that night, and about why someone wanted him arrested. Specifically him. The air shifted again. Inside, Camila peeked around the hallway corner. Mateo nodded. Okay. They didn't go far. Just to the cafe on the corner, one of those places with flickering lights and chipped mugs. The agent sat across from him. No laptop, no folders. Just a small notebook and a pen. Mateo, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Some of them might seem unrelated. Just answer as honestly as you can. He nodded slowly. Did you notice anyone following you the week before the arrest? No. Did you speak to anyone unusual online? Receive any strange messages? No, she paused. Do you know what a data packet is? Mateo blinked. No, Michelle sighed, not impatiently. 2 weeks before your arrest, someone accessed a secure server from a public Wi-Fi spot 3 blocks from your apartment. The IP address was flagged. The location matched the area where you work. That's why someone put your name on a monitor list. It wasn't a direct accusation, just suspicion. Mateo leaned back. Are you saying I was arrested because of a Wi-Fi signal? Not exactly. I'm saying someone wanted a scapegoat, and your profile was easy to use. Mateo didn't speak for a while. Outside, the rain turned to mist. Michelle continued, softer now. You're not in trouble. You're a kid who got caught in a net meant for someone else. But we think the officer who arrested you had access to this monitor list. He shouldn't have. It's federal, which means someone either gave him clearance or he took it. Why? Mateo asked. Why me? Michelle hesitated. Because you fit the pattern. Brown skin. Young. No rich parents. No one they expected to show up in court wearing medals. We walked back home that night. Mateo felt different. Not stronger. Not safer. Just aware. Aware that what had happened to him wasn't just about a broken taillight or a bad night. It was about systems. About names on lists. About who gets watched and who gets away with watching. Raphael stood at the window, watching him approach. What did they say? He asked as Mateo walked in. That I was in the wrong place. But someone else gave them permission to make me the wrong person. Raphael looked away. That was a truth he had trained men to fight against. And now it was in his own house. The next day, Internal Affairs called. Officer Granger had been suspended pending a full investigation. 3 more families had come forward with similar complaints. A pattern was forming. A pattern that could no longer be ignored. But none of it fixed what Mateo had lost. His job at the corner store hadn't called back. A neighbor who once offered rides now crossed the street. The landlord had left a voicemail about disturbances. And Camila had asked, more than once, are we going to have to move again? One night, while walking home from the pharmacy, Mateo passed a group of kids laughing outside a fast food place. One of them, a boy from school, pointed and laughed. Yo, look, it's the court kid. The others joined in. Mateo didn't say anything. He just kept walking. He passed by the convenience store where he'd been arrested. A new security camera blinked at him from the awning. He looked up, not in anger, just tired. He didn't sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the fridge and the soft breaths of his sister. Around 2 in the morning, he got up, opened his drawer, and pulled out a piece of paper. It was the last letter his mother had written before the stroke. Just a simple note she left on the fridge that day, reminding him to pick up eggs and to be patient with Camila when she asked too many questions. At the bottom, she'd added, "You're stronger than you think, and better than this world sometimes deserves." He sat there for a long time. Then he started writing something else. A letter. To no one in particular. Just a letting go. Of what he couldn't fix. Of what they couldn't take. 2 days later, the landlord posted notice. The lease wouldn't be renewed. No explanation. Just a polite line. We've decided not to continue your rental contract. Raphael offered to fight it. Mateo shook his head. We'll find something else. But finding something else meant putting everything down. It meant packing Camila's drawings, folding memories into boxes, saying goodbye to a neighborhood that had never really embraced them, but still held the ghost of their mother's laugh, the echo of old footsteps, the scent of rice cooking late at night. On the last night there, Raphael sat alone on the balcony. Mateo joined him. Neither said anything for a while. Then Raphael reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. "What's that?" Mateo asked. "An application to a prep program in Maryland for leadership training and academic scholarships. They take students who've been through hard things, students who didn't quit." Mateo looked at it. "You want me to leave?" Raphael shook his head. "I want you to choose something for yourself. Not because you have to survive, but because you want to grow." Inside, Camila was sleeping on a mattress surrounded by boxes. Mateo stared out at the city one more time. It didn't look the same. The next morning, they left. Quietly. No neighbors waved. No golonbis. But when they got in the car, Raphael handed Mateo an envelope. Inside was a letter from a DHS agent. A short note. "Sometimes we only find the truth because someone chooses not to disappear. Thank you for standing still when the world pushed." Mateo didn't smile, but he folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the same envelope where his mother's note lived. He didn't know where the next stop would be, but he knew one thing. He wasn't walking alone anymore, and somewhere in the city, a file was being closed on Officer Granger. But another door was opening, one that would test Mateo in ways he hadn't imagined yet. He wasn't done fighting. But he was no longer just a name on a list. He was a boy the world had tried to break and failed. The air in Maryland was colder, sharper, the kind of cold that crept into your sleeves and stayed with you long after you stepped inside. Mateo zipped up his borrowed jacket and stood in front of the campus gates. This place didn't look like anything he'd ever known. Wide courtyards, red brick buildings, students in navy sweaters moving with quiet purpose. Everything about it felt distant, clean, controlled. He wasn't sure if he belonged. He wasn't sure if anyone here had ever walked home holding groceries like armor or stood in court while strangers decided the shape of their future. But he was here because for the first time in his life, someone had looked at him and said, "Not what are you running from, but where do you want to go?" Raphael had driven him there that morning. They didn't say much during the ride, just the occasional note about the weather, the roads, the checklist. But as they pulled up to the gate, Raphael reached into the glove compartment and handed Mateo a folded map. "You won't need it," he said, "but it was mine. Thought you might want it." Mateo opened it. It was old, creased along the folds. At the bottom corner, a tiny note in fading ink. "There's always another route." Mateo didn't say thank you out loud, but his silence was full. Inside, the orientation was simple. Forms, ID photos, a brief meeting with the director, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes that softened when she spoke. "You're not here because someone saved you," she said. "You're here because you earned it." People like to pretend resilience is loud, but I've found it's usually quiet and stubborn. Mateo nodded once. That much he understood. Days passed, then weeks. Mateo got used to the rhythm. Wake up early, train, study, leadership classes, physical tests, quiet dinners in the hall, nights reviewing reading assignments while roommates argued softly about politics or philosophy. No one asked about where he came from. Some of them assumed he had a father in the military, which was true, but none of them knew about the courtroom, about Camila, about the weight he'd carried so long it had shaped his spine. One evening, after a group session on crisis response, a student asked him directly, "You ever had to deal with injustice, like in real life?" It was said with curiosity, not challenge. Mateo looked at the boy, a red-haired kid from Vermont with a name that sounded like money. Then he just said, "Yeah." The room went still for a moment, but he didn't explain. He didn't need to. What he didn't know was that across the country, his name had come up again. In a report submitted to the Federal Oversight Committee, DHS agent Michelle Landers had submitted a summary of wrongful arrests tied to unauthorized data use. At the top of the file was the name Mateo Rivera, not as a suspect, but as the example that broke open the entire chain. And below that, a recommendation. Eligible for federal academic and civic development scholarship. Subject has demonstrated composure, resilience, and moral integrity under high-stress conditions. The director of the program received the notice on a rainy Tuesday. She read it once, then again, then smiled to herself. She had known there was something about the boy who spoke little and listened too closely, something that couldn't be taught in a classroom. Back in Maryland, Mateo was beginning to change, not in a dramatic, overnight kind of way, but gradually. His posture lifted. His answers came more clearly. He started asking questions, not about survival, about strategy, about ethics, about justice. And every evening, after classes, he called Camila, asked about her day, reminded her to brush her teeth, listened as she read him short poems from the library. She didn't know the names of the things he was studying, but she knew his voice sounded steadier now. She told him that once. He didn't know how to respond, so he just said, "You too, kid." One Friday, as the students filed into a leadership simulation, they were told they'd be acting out real-world conflict scenarios. Mateo was assigned to lead a mock community meeting about racial profiling in urban policing. The topic hit him like cold water. He sat in the front of the room, hands on the table, surrounded by students pretending to be city officials, activists, journalists. When the simulation began, everyone spoke at once. Accusation. Defenses, excuses, silence. Then Mateo spoke. Not loud, but clear. We keep asking how to fix the system. But the real question is, who does the system protect? And who does it forget? The room quieted. He continued. I was arrested for buying bread. Because someone thought I looked like trouble. I wasn't. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the story they told about me before I even spoke. He looked around. No one interrupted. If you want to fix something, you have to see it first. Really see it. And then you have to listen. The director watched from the back of the room. Her expression didn't change. But when the session ended, she walked over to him. We're hosting a delegation from D.C. next month, she said. Policymakers, think tanks, education leaders. I want you to speak. Mateo blinked. Me? She nodded. No one else has your story. And no one else tells it like you do. The days leading up to the event passed quickly. Raphael visited the weekend before. They sat in a small cafe off campus. Mateo told him about the speech, about the nerves. Raphael listened carefully. You don't have to impress anyone, he said. Just tell the truth. That's enough. Mateo nodded. You think Mom will be proud? Raphael didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, then back. She'd cry. Then she'd bake a cake and tell all her friends her son was smarter than the president. The night before the speech, Mateo sat alone in the study room. He didn't write anything down. He just stared at his reflection in the window, thought about the courtroom, about the look on Granger's face, about the way the judge hesitated before granting his release, about Camila's hug, about the woman from DHS who asked questions no one else had thought to ask, about the way justice had crept in, not with a roar, but with a quiet click of a door opening. When he took the stage the next morning, the auditorium was quiet. Dozens of faces stared back, some curious, some skeptical, some distracted. Mateo took a breath, then began. My name is Mateo Rivera. I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit. Because of how I looked, because of where I was, because someone thought I wouldn't have anyone to speak for me. He paused, but I did. My sister, my lawyer, my father, and later, people who didn't even know me, who chose to look again. Another pause. I'm not here to blame anyone. I'm here to ask a question. What if the next kid doesn't have those voices? What if the system works exactly as designed, and the only thing broken is our belief that it ever worked differently? The room was silent. Not a cough, not a shift, just stillness. When he stepped down, no one clapped right away. Then someone stood, then another, until the whole room rose to their feet, not with the wild applause of performance, but the steady, respectful weight of recognition. Later, the director handed him a small envelope. Inside was a letter, an invitation, full scholarship, National Civic Leadership Program, Washington, D.C. Mateo stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Camila. We're moving again, he said. She squealed. Where to this time? Somewhere better, he said. Somewhere with more light. The next morning, Mateo packed his things, folded his jacket, picked up the map his father had given him. At the bottom, next to the fading ink, he added his own line. The road is hard, but I'm still walking. He didn't know what would come next, but he was ready. Ready not just to survive, but to build, to speak, to be more than what they had written on a file, that he was no longer just a defendant or a statistic. He was Mateo Rivera, and his story was just beginning. Washington, D.C. wasn't what Mateo expected. It wasn't just the landmarks or the way sunlight bounced off marble and glass. It was the pace, the conversations in coffee shops that felt like debates, the sense that every corner might hold someone with a title or a cause or a clipboard. But in the middle of all that urgency, Mateo found something he hadn't had in a long time. Space. Real space to breathe. Think. Learn. He settled into a small dorm room just outside the city, shared with another scholarship student from Detroit named Jalen, who had lost 2 brothers to gun violence and still managed to laugh like joy was something he owned. They talked late into the night, not just about policy or the news, but about music, memories, the kind of questions most people never ask them. Each morning, Mateo walked to his internship at a legal reform nonprofit. He didn't say much in meetings at first, just observed. But one afternoon, as a team reviewed a draft proposal on juvenile justice, he saw something in the language. A phrase. High-risk demographic. And he raised his hand. This line, he said quietly, it sounds like a warning, not a possibility. When you call someone high-risk, you stop seeing them as someone who could be something else. The room went quiet. Then the director leaned forward and said, "Rewrite it." Mateo did. That new paragraph made it into the final document. On weekends, he volunteered at a community kitchen in Southeast D.C. One day, as he was stacking boxes, a woman approached him. Short, older, soft-spoken. "You're the boy who spoke at the leadership conference last month, aren't you?" He nodded. She smiled and handed him a folded napkin. Inside was a drawing. A boy holding a balloon that said justice. "My grandson drew that after hearing you," she said. He asked if you were real. Mateo didn't know what to say, so he folded the napkin and put it in his wallet. Camila called him every evening. She had started a new school and was already running for student council. "I told them my brother is famous," she joked once, "and they said that explains why I talk too much." Mateo laughed, but he felt it. That strange, quiet pride of seeing someone younger become braver, because you didn't break when it would have been easier to. Raphael visited once a month, always in uniform, always proud. They didn't rehash the past anymore. They just talked about the future. About Camila. About what Mateo might do next. Law school, maybe, or something even bigger. One morning, Mateo was invited to a round table at the Capitol. Not as an intern, as a guest. The topic was data privacy and youth profiling. He wore a clean shirt, borrowed tie, polished shoes. He spoke calmly, not with anger, but with clarity. If you build systems that assume certain people will always be dangerous, then you stop asking why they're afraid. You stop seeing the child behind the file. I was that child. I was on a list. And I survived. But the next one might not. No one interrupted him. When he finished, a congresswoman from Arizona stood and shook his hand. "Thank you for reminding us that stories are more powerful than statistics." The weeks passed quickly. One afternoon, Mateo walked into the office of the nonprofit director and found her holding a letter. She looked up. "This came for you." He opened it. It was from Michelle Landers, the DHS agent. A short handwritten note. "Thought you should know. Granger has been officially removed." His badge was pulled. Internal Affairs closed the case. But it never would have reopened if you hadn't stood your ground. At the bottom, another line. "We need more like you on our side." That night, Mateo walked along the Potomac, the wind soft against his face. He thought of the night he had been arrested. The way the handcuffs had clicked into place like a verdict. The way no one had looked him in the eye. And now here he was. The same boy, but not. Stronger. Calmer. Still kind. Still tired. But seen. As he walked, a young boy on a scooter passed him, stopped, turned back. "Are you that guy from the video?" Mateo paused. "Maybe." The boy grinned. "My dad made me watch it. Said you reminded him of himself." Then he scooted away. Mateo stood there a moment, then smiled. Back in the apartment, Jalen had left a note on the table. "You're on the news again. Don't let it get to your head." Mateo laughed softly. Fame wasn't the point. It never had been. All he'd wanted was to be heard, to be believed, to be more than a headline written by someone who never knew his name. He spent the evening replying to letters from students across the country. Some angry, some hopeful, all of them honest. One girl wrote, "I watched your story in class. My brother's in jail for something he didn't do. I didn't know people like you existed. Please don't stop." Mateo folded that one carefully and taped it to the wall above his desk. Camila sent a voice message that night. "Guess what? I won the election. They said I speak with confidence. I told them I learned it from you." He didn't reply right away. He just listened to it again. Twice. Then came a moment. An email from the Office of Civic Development. Mateo had been selected as a keynote speaker for the National Youth Summit. He stared at the screen, heart steady, hands quiet. It wasn't just a stage. It was a full circle, a return, a soft kind of triumph. He wrote his speech slowly, not to impress, to remember, to heal. When the day came, he stood on that stage, looking out at hundreds of young faces, some smiling, some scared, all of them waiting. He took a breath and began. 3 years ago, I was a boy standing in court, being called a threat. Today, I stand before you as a student, a leader, and someone who still believes in dignity. Not because it was given to me, but because I held on to it, even when the world tried to take it away. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was long, steady, like rain after drought. When he returned to his seat, a teacher leaned over and whispered, "Thank you. My students needed to see this." Mateo nodded, but he wasn't thinking about stages or applause. He was thinking about Camila, about Lucia, about the apartment they had lost, and the home they had built inside each other. That evening, back in his room, Mateo sat by the window. The city lights blinked quietly. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line. Justice doesn't always arrive on time, but sometimes it still shows up. Then he closed the book, turned off the light, and smiled. The seasons turned gently in D.C., and by early spring, cherry blossoms lined the sidewalks like soft breath on cold glass. Mateo walked those streets in quiet wonder, not because he felt he belonged more than before, but because he no longer felt like he had to prove he did. His days were full: study, meetings, calls with Camila, and quiet hours volunteering at the youth center a few blocks from the metro. It wasn't glamorous. Sometimes he helped kids with homework. Sometimes he just sat on the floor and listened to stories about their neighborhoods, their parents, the fights they didn't tell teachers about. He never interrupted. He knew what it meant to have someone just sit and stay. One Saturday afternoon, as he was cleaning up after an arts workshop, a small boy tapped his elbow. He couldn't have been older than 7. Curly hair, shy eyes. "My sister said you were in jail once," the boy said. Mateo paused, then knelt beside him. "Yeah, I was. For a little while. I didn't do anything wrong, but it happened." The boy nodded like he understood more than most adults did. "My uncle's in jail. He didn't do nothing either. My grandma says the system don't like brown people." Mateo stayed quiet, then gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Sometimes the system gets it wrong, but people are working to change it. And you matter. You're not invisible." The boy looked up and smiled, tooth missing on the left side. "Okay, I believe you." Weeks later, a teacher from a local high school reached out. She had seen Mateo speak online and asked if he would visit her classroom. He didn't think much of it, just said yes. When he arrived, the students were already seated, some half asleep, others scrolling their phones. But when he stepped in, silence settled fast. He didn't speak like a teacher. He didn't lecture. He just told his story about the court, the badge, the misunderstanding, the wait, and how he stood still. One student raised her hand. "Weren't you scared?" Mateo smiled softly. "Terrified, but being scared doesn't mean you give up. It just means you keep breathing until the fear passes." After the class, one of the students slipped him a folded note. He opened it later on the bus. "You made me want to try again. I thought nobody ever came back from stuff like that." He folded the paper carefully and kept it in the same envelope where his mother's note and Camila's drawings lived. At the community center that evening, the director pulled Mateo aside. "There's something I want you to see." She led him into a small hallway, to a bulletin board he hadn't noticed before. On it were photos of volunteers, events, workshops, and in the middle, a photo taken on a rainy day. Mateo, bent down, tying the shoe of a crying child in a yellow jacket. He didn't even remember the moment. Below the photo, a caption. Sometimes leadership means kneeling. Spring moved into early summer. Camila came to visit for the first time, her eyes wide as she took in the city. "This is where you live?" she asked, both proud and slightly overwhelmed. Mateo showed her everything: the library, the park, the ice cream spot she'd heard about on TikTok. One evening, they sat by the water. She leaned against his arm and whispered, "You're really happy here." He didn't answer. He just looked at the water, then said, "I'm peaceful." "That's better." As they walked home, a woman passed them, paused, then turned. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you Mateo Rivera?" He nodded, unsure. "I just wanted to thank you. My nephew is applying to law school because of your story. He said you made him believe he didn't have to be angry to be strong." Mateo's face flushed. He simply nodded. The woman left without saying more, but the weight of her words stayed. One morning, months later, he received a letter from his old high school in Chicago. A new principal had taken over. She invited him to speak at the graduation ceremony. He hesitated. The last time he walked those halls, it had been as a dropout. Now he was being asked to return as a guest of honor. He took a breath, then accepted. The auditorium looked smaller than he remembered, but the faces were the same: youthful, hopeful, worn in quiet ways. Mateo stepped up to the podium and let the silence stretch a few seconds. "I didn't graduate from here," he began. "I walked away because life asked me to choose between feeding my sister and sitting in a classroom. That wasn't the school's fault. That was the system. But I came back, because sometimes the road circles around, and you get to say the things you didn't know how to before." He didn't give advice. He just told the truth. That life would be unfair, that some of them would be judged before they opened their mouths, but also that their names had weight, that their presence was power, that kindness, even when unseen, was never wasted. When he finished, the principal handed him a small certificate. Honorary alumnus. With distinction. Mateo looked at it, then tucked it into his bag beside the other papers that told a quieter, fuller story of who he was. That night, back in the apartment, Mateo sat with Camila as she showed him her latest drawing. It was of their old apartment. Cramped. Warm. In the corner, a boy sat reading while a girl danced in the kitchen. "It's us," she said. He nodded. "You remember that day?" "Yeah," she said. "I didn't know it was hard for you back then. You always smiled." Mateo looked at her, eyes soft. "That's because you were watching." Later, as he sat alone by the window, he thought of everything that had passed. The courtroom, the badge, the fear, the speeches, the quiet meals, the letters, the photos, the nameless faces who had changed his life without ever knowing it, and the people he'd quietly changed in return. He thought about how justice hadn't come all at once. It had crept in slowly, like dawn, and sometimes not at all. But he was still here, still kind, still walking. Somewhere in a small community center in Chicago, a new bulletin board had gone up. At the center, a photo of a boy in a hoodie, standing in court, hands at his sides, eyes steady. No caption, no summary, just presence. And beside it, a line from a letter someone once wrote. "There's always another route." Mateo folded the map his father gave him and placed it in a new frame, hung it above his desk. Then he sat down, opened a blank page, and began to write again. Not because he had something to prove, but because he had something to give. A voice, a light, a way forward. He smiled to himself, softly. Sometimes healing doesn't come with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives in a folded note, a child's drawing, a quiet walk home, and in the simple act of not giving up. Late afternoon light spilled gently across the park benches as Mateo sat quietly, his fingers resting on the edge of a weathered notebook. Beside him, Camila laughed with a group of younger kids, helping them build paper boats to float in the shallow stream nearby. There was nothing extraordinary about the moment. No cameras, no microphones, just wind, laughter, and the quiet echo of a life that had once been fractured, now finding its rhythm again. A woman walking her dog slowed as she passed. She glanced at Mateo, then paused. Thank you, she said softly. You probably don't remember me, but I remember your story. It helped me talk to my son differently. Mateo looked up surprised. She didn't stay long, just nodded once and continued on. Mateo watched her disappear into the trees, heart still for a moment, not from pride, but from a quiet kind of peace that comes when you realize your pain helped light someone else's path. He opened his notebook and turned to a blank page. The pen moved slowly, not to prove anything, not to convince, just to capture. One line at a time, he wrote not what he had lost, but what he had learned. That justice doesn't always arrive when it should. That silence is not always weakness. That sometimes the loudest power lies in the choice to stay kind when the world gives you every reason not to be. Across the street, a small mural had begun to fade with time. It showed the outline of a boy standing alone, a shadow behind him, and above it, a phrase now almost washed away. Sometimes the fight is simply to stay human. That boy used to be Mateo. Now, he was something more as he stood, gathered the boats Camila had left behind, and took one last look at the sky. Then he turned, notebook in hand, and walked home with his sister. No headlines, no applause, just footsteps, just light, and somewhere quietly, another boy watched him pass, whispered to his friend, "That's the one I told you about. The one who didn't quit." Mateo didn't hear it. But maybe he didn't have to, because sometimes the legacy isn't the noise you make. It's the silence you fill with meaning. This is Cracks of Light, where we don't chase sensational headlines, we honor quiet strength. Where we believe that even in the darkest places, someone is always watching. And sometimes someone is choosing to rise. That if you believe kindness is power, if you believe dignity matters, if you believe stories can heal, like, comment, share this story not for the numbers, but because someone somewhere might need to hear this. Until the next story finds you, stay kind, stay human, stay in the light.